right, good afternoon. So today we have the pleasure of welcoming back Professor Christopher Kutz from Berkeley, who yesterday delivered the 2012 Emet lecture, jointly sponsored by the Emet Fund and the Nathanson Centre on Transnational Human Rights, Crime and Security. So as has now become a tradition, the day following the Emet lecture, we have a little seminar where we discuss the lecture, and as is now common, we typically have two respondents who make comments and then give the lecture, the Emet lecture this year, Professor Chris Kutz, an opportunity to respond, and then we open to the floor for a more general discussion. And today the two respondents are myself and François Tanguay-Renaud here, professor at Osgoode, and Louis-Philippe Hodgson, professor of philosophy here at York University. And I'll be the first respondent. So yesterday, Chris presented a very thought-provoking lecture in which he advanced what he calls a non-telic conception of democracy. And this non-telic conception is to be understood in opposition to a telic conception, which understands democracy as a normative end state. That is a set, and these are his words, a set of institutions for distributing political decision-making on the basis of a universal franchise, which is valuable either instrumentally, I take it, or intrinsically, or both, because it is especially or uniquely well-suited to yield just social outcomes, given its roots in principles of substantive moral equality of all persons and procedural mutual justification in the making of a given political community's basic decisions. Now, one problem with this way of thinking about democracy, Kutz tells us, is that when coupled with a cosmopolitan perspective that rejects the normative significance of national boundaries, which I take it as a perspective that Professor Kutz adheres to, well, it tends to provide too strong a justification for those who are inclined to promote democracy or who feel are under a duty to promote it in international relations. Now here Kutz means, or seems to mean, too strong a justification primarily in an epistemic sense. That is, state leaders who begin with a telic perspective on democracy, begin with an assumption that their motivation to export democracy to undemocratic societies is good, and that the democratic institutions that they hope to encourage or bring about in such societies would be an improvement. And this kind of reasoning, Professor Kutz tells us, makes it too easy for these leaders to miss the quote-unquote considerations on the other side. That is, given the number and the complexity of other factors, both internal and external to a society, that are relevant to deciding whether international intervention in it is justified, including, for example, possibilities of blowback or other unintended consequences. And given the empirical fog that tends to cloud these issues, well, the telic perspective simply stacks the deck too heavily in favor of intervention in ways that are likely to lead to unjust or illegitimate so-called pro-democracy international interventions. Now here I would have thought that even if telic Democrats are right, an inquiry into and an emphasis on a proportionality side constraint in international relations could largely contain this dangerous kind of reasoning. As Professor Kutz himself seems to acknowledge, democratic holy wars are likely to be far too rough and indiscriminate, resulting in the killings of countless innocents to be justified merely in the name of sounder institutions. So may, for example, blockades or embargoes that would result, for example, in deadly famines. Yet other kinds of interventions, such as naming and shaming or softer economic sanctions, may be proportionate and thus permissible. Still, Professor Kutz may reply, what if it could be demonstrated with reasonable certainty that forcefully implementing democratic institutions in an undemocratic society would yield conditions of justice that would make a radically positive difference in the lives of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people over many generations. And these people would otherwise suffer pretty severe injustices. Can't some international force be justified in bringing about such institutions? Here, Professor Kutz tells us, problems of incommensurability aside, that there is an important epistemic or one may say empirical question, about whether, and these are his words, social conditions in the undemocratic society are sufficiently developed to sustain democratic institutions that will be forcefully implemented over authoritarian competitors. If the social conditions are not sufficiently developed, then the tele-democratic interventions are unlikely to succeed. And it seems reasonable to contend a reasonable chance of success is likely another important side constraint to international interventions, especially for forceful ones. Yet imagine that we could know whether there was a reasonable chance of success, that democratic institutions could be implemented proportionately in an utterly undemocratic society, and at a reasonable cost for the interveners, and would result in a thriving democracy bringing much greater justice and welfare to all in the given society for generations. Now, this scenario may be very unlikely, even implausible, to the point of wondering whether it's even worth considering. Yet a doubt may linger, right? After all, post-intervention Germany, Japan, Italy, post-boycott South Africa are now thriving democracies. So it might be possible to bring democracy to other kinds of undemocratic societies of different sorts. Still, Professor Kutz might say, there's a deeper metaphysical objection to seeking to export democracy through international interventions. That is, democracy is not really an end state after all, but it's more of an organic process, right? It's a form of collective agency to be respected as opposed to be maximized. It exists in the orientation of a group's individual members around the possibilities of collective action. It's an active practice developed from the inside out. It's not a slogan, it's a practice, we're told, always on the brink of unraveling, made up of messy webs of micro bargains, social, economic, and political, through which we navigate a dangerous world on the rafts we make together. Just beautiful wording. Its value is intrinsic, akin to the liberal value of individual autonomy, but it's understood collectively along the lines of group self-authorship or self-determination. Now, at times, Professor Kutz seems to flirt with dangerous and ontological assumptions about the nature of that value, arguing that it is to be understood as a very significant value that is irreducibly collective, and these are his words, practically and conceptually separable from the value of the individuals themselves. Now, at first glance at least, this formulation is reminiscent of rather ominous theories from times past, prioritizing the value of the collective, the community, over the individual, thus allowing, for example, the sacrifice of innocence at the altar of communalism. In the end, though, unfortunately, Professor Kutz seems to fall on the side of the much more prevalent and I think sounder value individualistic or value humanist position, according to which the value of anything derives from its worth for individuals, or at least sentient beings. The value of democracy as a collective practice, we're told, merely supervenes on the existence, beliefs, and action patterns of individuals, and is to be judged relative to them. Still, one may wonder, if the basic unit of evaluation remains the individual, why may we not understand the value of democracy in purely individualistic terms, namely as grounded in the fact that individuals are social beings and need communal ties and somewhat organized and respectful interpersonal interactions to be able to realize themselves as individuals. Professor Kutz seems to think that this is the main fault of just war theorists like Jeff McMahon, who seem to treat the justification of war as purely grounded in individual interests and values. Although I'm unclear whether McMahon has yet made this claim at least universally clear. But be that as it may, there is something more than individual interest, Kutz claims. There is the collective we that's instantiated in a nascent practice of democracy, which has value over and above the sum of individuals' self-realization and well-being. And that value is significant, and the argument goes, can present a significant obstacle to the permissibility of pro-democracy international interventions and justify a greater range of self-defensive rights against it. So I wanted to summarize the position as I understand it a bit, so as to be able to ask a number of more defined questions and to situate the debate. First, if the value merely exists as a supervenient value, one may wonder how weighty it really is in comparison with non-supervenient individualized interests and values, which is what telic democrats may seek to promote, and in relation to which the supervenient value ought to be understood. That is, I'd like to hear a bit more about the nature of conflicts between supervenient and non-supervenient values, and whether they're meant to be resolved in the same way as conflicts between, I'll call them basic values. Second, it seems that the value of democracy as political agency, which Professor Kutz advances, is, in a sense, itself telic in a number of ways, which may raise the suspicion that it may not be so different in character after all. Indeed, as Professor Kutz himself recognizes, group political agency may encompass forms of social interactions and ordering that are deeply exploitative and cruel. He seems to want to exclude them from the valuable practice of democracy, as they're not oriented towards the ideals of moral equality, justice, and enhanced welfare, which are the ones typically thought to ground the telic conception of democracy. Yet can't the collective we be realized through such practices, even if it is a despicable or a less valuable we? Assuming the truth of Hitler's willing executioners, for the sake of argument, would the we emanating from Hitler's Germany have any value? And if so, ought it to be given any consideration in the international intervention calculus? At some point when discussing the cases of Libya and Syria, Professor Kutz speaks of the minimal sense of demanding a leader whose authority stems from mass consent. Is that the threshold of value? There's another telic dimension that, again, Professor Kutz himself seems to recognize, right? As he claims, a group of people, and these are his words, living together, working out a scheme of cooperation, hierarchy, subordination, and discipline, is what grounds democracy's normative claims, the nascent practice of democracy. Yet, as he also recognizes, this is a work that is necessarily collective before it is democratic. So one may then ask why this is where the value of democracy stems from, and why Professor Kutz is offering us a distinctively democratic theory. Philip Pettit and Christian List have recently argued that groups can be conversible agents. They can organize themselves in irreducible ways that allow them to do business, to live up to expectations, and ultimately to be sensitive to reason in a reasonably consistent way, to differentiate between right and wrong, and to act morally, qua group. Pettit and List argue that when groups are not so organized and significant harms arise from their aggregate behavior, they may sometimes be held responsible and even sanctioned so as to prompt them to organize themselves in a way that ensure that they will act in morally justified ways, qua group, in the future. Nowhere does democracy form an essential part of the picture. And an implication of their argument is that group political agency may have value even if not democratic. There may not be any natural teleology, to use Professor Kutz's words, of democracy, but there may be a natural teleology of group moral action. So one may ask, what makes practiced political agency democratic, if not the same kind of orientation as on the telic view? And to the extent that the value of practiced political agency is not intrinsically democratic in that sense, are we not talking about something, perhaps a value, different from democracy? Of course, the active or agential component of the conception of democracy or of politics, more widely understood, somewhat differentiates it from a more passive conception of democracy defined as a mere end state. And that we're told has value that ought to be respected and should constrain foreign intervention. Assuming that this value is indeed democratic in essence, which I've questioned, well, what does it mean for it to be respected? Well, we're told that it should be allowed to evolve from within and cannot be imposed from outside. Yet, couldn't helping to create the conditions for it be valuable? Again, Professor Kutz seems to say that sometimes and in some ways this may be permissible. For example, through criticism of an undemocratic regime, or even through economic sanctions, but not through war, blockades, or troops on the ground. But isn't this an admission of a somewhat latent telic dimension in the conception of democracy that Professor Kutz advocates? And to that extent, can it really serve as the constraint that he claims it can? To repeat, the intuitive conclusion here may be that it is actually proportionality and a reasonable chance of success as conditions that do the heavy lifting in restraining armed interventions, and not so much recognition of political agency, as this may itself represent a kind of slippery slope. So these were my main comments. I have a few slight concluding questions, which I don't know exactly where they fit, but I just want to put them on the table while concluding. Thoughts that I had while listening to the lecture yesterday. Does the act-omission distinction make a difference to the calculus that Professor Kutz advocates? In the lecture, he spoke yesterday mostly of intervention, and that has a positive act ring to it. Could the value of democracy as political agency be respected by simply refusing to deal with an undemocratic regime, either partially or completely, be it in terms of trade, aid, tourism, diplomatic relations, etc., or are interferences through acts and omissions to be understood along a continuum? So I just would like to hear more about this. I also want to ask a question about the provocative claim that the democracies that are the most worth supporting are the ones least in need of support. Is the thought that more muscular intervention may be justified in long-established liberal democracies, where, for example, through democratic means, a regime with autocratic tendencies is elected or is on the brink of being elected, than, say, in Saudi Arabia or Syria or Libya, where so many disenfranchised constituencies are unable to bring about change on their own, simply because it is part of who they are, right? It's the Algeria that the Algerians have. Because it's part of the Saudi or the Libyan or the Syrian collective we. Isn't this kind of outlook, in a sense, reminiscent of the same kind of paternalistic attitude that Kutz otherwise decries? And finally, I remain puzzled by the claim that the grounds of democracy were not present in a country like Libya prior to the intervention. Right? There were many Libyan tribes that had organizational structures, interactions, and micro-bargains that are reminiscent of what Professor Kutz elsewhere claims are valuable. So if state boundaries are not the boundaries of valuable agential democracy, then why take Libya as a whole as the locus of evaluation? So that's what I have to say, and I'll pass it on to Professor Hodgson.
All right. I feel like we should insert a joke about French Canadians wearing green shirts and tweed jackets at this point. We can leave it to the audience to figure the exact form of the joke. Thank you. So I'm very happy to be commenting on this paper, which I found very interesting. Unfortunately for me, I found it mostly very sensible. I think a lot of the claims that Professor Kutz makes are claims that I'm sympathetic with. But I do have quite a few requests for clarification and elaboration and so on. So, so let me start by situating a little bit what I took to be the main issue, although François did a very good job of situating us already. So I take the main issue to be, how should the value of democracy feature in the way we think about intervention? Mm-hmm. And more specifically, how we think about the use of force on the international stage. And I take it the starting point is the idea that there's a kind of paradox in our thinking. So we tend to think democracy is a very important political value. Some people think it's the most important political value. And so there's a tendency to think that promoting democracy will justify a lot of things, and maybe justify intervention, forceful intervention, and so on. And then there are two sets of worries about this. So there are practical worries, namely that a lot of countries are not democratic, a lot. And so if we have this stringent conception of democracy as setting the bar for legitimacy, then we're going to justify intervention left and right. And that seems not a good idea. That seems like it'll backfire. We will probably stretch our resources too thin, and so on and so forth. So there's all these worries in the background, but there's still the question, in principle, does the aim of promoting democracy justify intervention, even though in practice it's almost always going to be a bad idea. But then there's a deeper worry that Professor Kutz articulates very nicely. And I take it the form of this worry is there's something weird about the thought that the ideal of democracy specifically would justify all sorts of outside intervention. If you think about what the ideal is, it's weird that it would call for a lot of outsiders to come in and fix things for you. Democracy doesn't seem to be about that. And so that's a paradox that's specific to the ideal of democracy that you wouldn't have in the case of promoting the human right not to be tortured, say. There isn't such a paradox. So I think it's a great virtue of this paper that it brings out this philosophical worry, that it articulates it in a very interesting way. The articulation mostly takes the form of this, these two conceptions of democracy that François already did some work in outlining. The telic conception, which sees democracy as a goal to be achieved, and that I take it stresses the institutional dimension of democracy. So we start with a view of what democratic institutions would look like, and then we say the goal is to put those institutions in place everywhere. And then there's the agential conception of democracy, where we see democracy as being more about a collective process, about the blossoming of collective political agency or something like that. Basically, it's about people getting together and working things out for themselves. And so these two views will make you react very differently to the thought that a country is less than democratic. On the first view, you think, well, maybe we should put in place these institutions that they don't have. On the second view, that doesn't seem so attractive because the value of democracy is fundamentally that people should work things out for themselves. So let me start with a fairly straightforward question, which François already touched on. So the first question that arises, I think, is why wouldn't working things out for yourself, figuring out what institutions you'll have, why wouldn't that just be one value among many political values? Why would we think that it's the value, that it trumps all the other ones? And indeed, even if we stay within the democratic ideal, why wouldn't we think it's one value among many values in the democratic ideal? I mean, it seems very tempting to say something like the following. Part of the democratic ideal is that everyone should have a meaningful say in the decisions we make. In our system, we try to realize that with universal adult suffrage. Maybe there's other ways to realize it, but you should have something like that going on. Another part of the democratic ideal is that you should find a way to realize this ideal, everyone having a meaningful say, yourself. So we should find a way through a domestic process to attain that goal. Now, if the domestic process through which you achieve the goal, that is also part of the democratic ideal, is relatively smooth, and if it's headed in the right direction, then it's win-win. What democracy demands is unambiguous. But if the process is not so smooth, or if it's not headed in a direction that could plausibly realize the other values of democracy, then it's not so simple. Then it looks like some of the values of democracy will be compromised anyway. And so the question is, what do we say then? And again, why would we think that the working things out for yourself ends up being so dominant? So there's one passage in the lecture that I found particularly interesting on this point that I want to quote, if I may. It goes as follows. From the perspective of active democracy, what matters about democracy is not just the equal weighting of interests, nor, more ambitiously, the equal weighting of chances to affect common decisions. To be sure, both of Both of these factors are important and explain the centrality of the majoritarian vote within democratic theory as the most perspicuous way of representing the commitment to a principle of equal effect. But, this is the important part, those aspects of democracy represent its passive aspect, the way in which it functions as a managerial mechanism for reconciling different interests. They are thus essentially political interpretations of Benthamite utilitarianism, and rest on the same principle of negative responsibility as unrestrained consequentialism more generally. Now, I mean, to me at least, once something starts looking like Benthamite utilitarianism, it starts looking pretty bad.
Some of my best friends are Benthamites.
Okay. But in any case, there's certainly something attractive about this idea that democracy is fundamentally meant to be an active ideal. So it's not just about having your needs satisfied. That's something else. That's utilitarianism. It's about bringing things about for yourself. It's about being active. So this way of contrasting the two conceptions, putting it in terms of active versus passive, that certainly clarified things for me to some extent. It's important to note, though, that there is an active part to the telic conception as well, because it includes a procedural principle that says that the goals should be brought about ideally through a decision that people take part in, and so on and so forth. But I think the claim here is that the telic conception doesn't capture how central the idea of activity is to the democratic ideal. So the thought is, it's not just that it's better if you bring about the institutions in the right way. It's that the ideal of democracy is most essentially an ideal of activity. So it simply can't be brought about from the outside. That undercuts the ideal. So I find this line of thought very attractive, but I also have worries about it. I mean, so I'd like something like that to be correct, but I have a hard time with some of the details. A general worry. If we take the ideal to be fully endogenous democracy, so democracy that's brought about fully from within, then there's still the question, what should we do when the ideal is out of reach for the foreseeable future? What should we do when there doesn't seem to be any way that that's what's going to happen? If we can't live up to the ideal in any meaningful way, if what's going on is a sort of travesty of democracy in any case, then we have to ask, in such circumstances, what does the ideal demand of us? To put it in Rawls's terms, we have to switch to non-ideal theory. And then what we should do in cases like that depends on the structure of the ideal. And I think we'll only get the result that Professor Kutz is arguing for if we can show not only that endogenous activity, or this sort of internal process, is the most important part of democracy, but we have to show something like that it's lexically prior to all other components of the ideal, to use another terms from Rawls. So that's actually quite a tall order, showing that you don't think about the other parts of democracy until you've satisfied this first part, the endogenous activity part. So that's sort of the general structure of my worry. To phrase it a bit more specifically, I think the question we have to ask is, what kind of activity are we talking about here when we say that democracy is about activity? And maybe more importantly, whose activity are we talking about? To put it a little bit differently, the idea of collective agency comes up a lot in this paper. And in that respect, it's a paper fully of its time. This is an idea that comes up a lot in philosophy these days, in all sorts of ways. But I take it in some ways this plays a very important role in the way Professor Kutz is approaching the problem, because I think at some level his view is that the fundamental value is really collective political agency. That's really what's driving the whole thing. And I think democracy on this kind of view just ends up being a particularly good way to realize the value of collective political agency. But it may not be the only way. And more importantly, I think on this view, whenever there's something like collective political agency going on, it's worthy of respect. So that seems to me a very attractive line of thought to take. But then some questions that we need to ask, I think. One is, what exactly does it take for a group to form a collective political agent? How low is the bar for that? And then why would we think that forming a pretty bad collective political agent has such a great value that it raises a significant barrier against the possibility of intervention? One thing on this general topic that came up a little bit in the lecture that I wanted to bring up again in the hope of generating further discussion is the status of collective agents is problematic in a way that the status of individual agents is usually not. Because with individual agents, you have the body that's, for all practical purposes, indivisible. And so you have a sense in which I'm a unit of agency because I have one body. In the case of collective agents, there's always the question, why are we saying there's an agent, a collective agent, instead of just a collection of individuals? And how do we know that the collective agent encompasses not just some of the individuals, but all of them? Which for these kinds of cases ends up being quite a hard question. Right, so we take the case of a country that's not democratic, and in which there's clear discrimination against the minority, but not to a point where R2P would kick in. Right, so their human rights are not routinely violated, but they're clearly victims of injustice. The question is, why would they see themselves as part of a collective political agent with everybody else who's there? Or to put it in terms of that other contrast that I like in the paper, in what sense are they active? In what sense is any ideal of activity being realized for them by the fact that some people in the group are pushing them around? And here I think that there are very important differences with the individual case that are worth thinking about. You know, when I'm granted the right to decide for myself, I may make mistakes, I may make bad decisions, but that won't give rise to part of me having a claim against all of me or something like that. But if I make a decision to quit smoking, but it doesn't get its way against my desire to smoke, it's not like part of me can stand up and say, this is an outrage, we're going to secede, we're not going to have this, and so on and so forth. Because the smallest unit that could launch this kind of complaint would be a person, so me. But in the case of political communities, if there's a group of individuals who are basically ordering the other ones around, then it seems like there are agents who can stand up and say, why do I have to put up with this? How am I represented? How is this activity on my part? And then it seems you can't tell them what you could tell an individual, that part of deciding for yourself is making your own mistakes. I mean, maybe from the outside we're tempted to say that. I would say, oh, they're just making mistakes right now, but they'll figure it out. But what they're complaining about is that they don't get to decide at all. Others are deciding for them. And so, to put it again a little bit differently, why would it matter to me if there's an active political community somewhere in my vicinity if I'm not part of it? Let me skip ahead a little bit since I don't want to take up too much time. So one thing it's tempting to say, I think, is the absence of outside interference is a necessary condition for the purest form of self-determination. Right? So if you want the full-fledged ideal of democracy, then outside interference wouldn't be part of that. But if you have a big mess, then it's going to be an open question what the value of self-determination demands. And then it's quite tempting to say, well, maybe a bit of a push from the outside, if it's going to get results, is actually a good idea. Now, of course, this leaves us with all the pragmatic worries. We know we're not good at this sort of stuff. We know we shouldn't try. But that's not the same thing as saying that in principle there's no justification here for intervening. Let me finish by just airing a few thoughts about why the bar on forming a collective political agent might be lower than we otherwise would think. And I'm just curious to know to what extent Professor Kutz is attracted to this way of thinking about it to buttress his intuitions on this point. So here are a couple of, very basic, famous thoughts from the great thinkers of political philosophy. A first thought is, if you're starting from scratch, then how you could go about forming a people is something of a mystery. So how you could constitute a collective political agent is a bit of a mystery. And here we have Rousseau's lesson, right? He says, the social contract to be legitimate requires unanimity. And this, in at least one way of looking at it, seems to be the only fully legitimate way to form a people. You just need everybody to say, yes, we will form a people and make decisions together. There's this wonderful passage where Rousseau says, if at the time of the social compact there are opponents to it, their opposition does not invalidate the contract, but only prevents them from being included in it. They are foreigners among the citizens. Now, of course, one problem with this general approach is we never get unanimity about anything in human affairs, so this doesn't seem very promising. Another problem, and this is where I think we're getting ideas that might be useful in this context. Another problem is we can't have foreigners walking among us. If the state is to protect our rights against one another, then it has to control the whole territory and apply its rule to all those on the territories. Which I take it is why Rousseau, right after the sentence I read, writes, once the state is established, consent lies in residence. To dwell in the territory is to submit to the sovereignty. Because he's thinking you can't have people on the territory who aren't subject to the rule of the state. And this is a common theme among the classical political philosophers of that era. The state has a certain task to perform. If you're Hobbes, you think it's providing security. If you're Locke, you think it's securing rights. If you're Rousseau, you think it's realizing freedom or something like that. But all these things can only be performed if the state has a monopoly of power on a given territory. So the thought would be, there's a sense in which we need something like a state on each territory. And so if this is true, maybe there's a kind of natural unity to states after all. Maybe territories for states are a little bit like bodies for individuals. That is, they make self-constitution or unification or something like that necessary. Now, of course, this can't be quite right because territories are divisible in a way that bodies aren't. At least it's a lot less messy.
Or not, but yes.
Yeah, or not. Yeah, it's true. It depends if you're dividing both bodies and territories, as things tend to go. So if you compound these thoughts about the importance of territory with the thought that it's unclear how you could really go about to form a people from scratch, then the suggestion is that there's a pretty strong presumption to say if we have a group of people on a territory and they have something that acts like a state, then the presumption should be that's their state. We have to start with that because it's unclear how else you go about things. And so here one wants to echo Thomas Nagel's, or the young Thomas Nagel's thoughts about sex and say, bad government is better than none at all. And as he put it wonderfully, the alternatives have to be fairly grim before it becomes rational to opt for nothing. But then there are two sets of questions that this raises, I think. One is that the alternative we're thinking about is not opting for nothing, but it's having a group within the society that's aiming to form a more democratic kind of government. And so there's a question, how much can this presumption that if there's a state, we should take it to be legitimate, how much weight can that have against the fact that it's a state that's actually quite bad and that some people have maybe a chance of putting something much better in its place? The other question that this would give rise to is, I think there are arguments in political philosophy that suggest that the bar for legitimacy should not be taken to be too high because the alternatives are quite grim. But I'm not sure they have to do with the ideal of democracy. These seem to be different considerations. And so I'm not sure they would provide us reason for thinking that whatever government is there is realizing an ideal of activity or forms a collective agent in a meaningful sense, or anything like that. So I'll stop there.
Okay, well, Professor Kutz,
Well,
the floor is yours.
I was honored to be invited to the lecture. I'm even more honored for you both to have taken the time for these wonderful responses. And at least the first part before you got to the criticism, I was thinking, wow, that was a good paper I wrote. It sounds so nice, I think, being re-articulated much more clearly. And then the criticisms that we're thinking about. The criticisms are terrific as well. And I think I'm not going to have, I think I will have lost track of many of the points, so you'll please remind me of them. The major issue between the two of you is this wonderfully put issue about how do we think about trade-offs. Why do I think that the value of democracy is as important as it is? Should I be speaking into that?
It's just as a backup because the other one's a bit low. It's just carry on as normal.
Okay. Why do I think it's as important as it is? And I guess the sort of the example I was toying with in the back of my mind as you were speaking is, thinking about Afghanistan in 2001, 2002, in which one could easily imagine sort of the following dialogue. Remember being in these conversations, sort of dialogues on the American left, which is that whatever one thinks about the invasion, it's wonderful to liberate girls and women from horribly sexist environment in which their basic human capacities are denied and negated. And okay, so maybe Afghanistan's not quite the right example. The Taliban is so closely allied with Al-Qaeda that it's hard to see it as on the value end of political agency. I do think that it's not that any form of collective political organization has value, but ones that are aiming to the Taliban before, say the Taliban before Al-Qaeda, before the involvement with Al-Qaeda, or in governing its own territory is probably as hard a test case as I'll want. And it's but without the external aggression, you might say there's a trade-off. There's a denial of, in this case, Afghan men's interest in political self-organization, but it's in favor of, but it's an intervention in favor of justice. And why not think that these girls and young women's claim to justice or to some form of liberation is stronger than any value of political agency? Is that a fair example then for the kind of issue you're raising? Okay, so I guess there are a few things to say. One is that I do think there are multiple and conflicting values. I don't think that everything reduces to the value of political agency, and justice and democracy can come apart at various points. The exercise of democracy can lead to unjust outcomes. That seems to me I think it is a reasonably good system for maximizing justice, but it's not inevitable. So I'm happy to acknowledge that there is a conflict between the two values. I think one thing to say though is to wonder whether it's a long-term conflict, to wonder whether there is a telos within democracy towards greater justice, whether democratic societies that develop on their own move towards equality. And it seems to me that that's an empirical claim, but it seems to me one that is largely true, although it can take time to get there. But that the concerns about immediate injustice, the concerns about the immediate conflict, can to some extent be eased by taking a longer time view of the conflict, that political self-determination will generally result in an expanding circle of rights and justice. But that's not enough. What I also think, this is maybe to go back to the initial example I gave of the sort of the addict intervention, and maybe want a better example there. But political agency is a distinctive kind of value. It's analogous to the value of individual autonomous agency. It's a special kind of value. It's not that values of justice or values of equality derive entirely from it. I think there are other sources for commitments to equality. But in one sense, they have their ground in the political agency. The right, the set of political rights that we think are important are rights that are consequent on a polity forming. A justice is the kind of value it is because it's a value that's realized internally to an institution of a people. So there are people have other interests. They have interests other than being governed well. They have interests in living well. Some people don't. Some people would rather be off the grid, rather not be governed. It's not that there's a sort of confusing passage in the longer version of the paper in which I talk about a kind of objections to an Aristotelian view that our natural, our highest form of being lies in politics. I find that view sometimes on alternate days tempting, but not convincing. But one can say that there are people for whom politics is not a value, while nonetheless saying that that forming a political community is the ground of a wide range of values that I'll call political values. I guess this takes us back into the discussion we were having before about human rights, of whether on the orthodox or the political side. And I guess I'm on a political side. I see an important range of values as being connected to the project of forming a political community. And so I should say I'm sloppy about words that many people are very careful about, supervening, deriving from, and so on. I'm not quite sure what the right metaphysics is, but the value of forming political agency is one that I think dominates other claims. It dominates in the conflict between the value of political agency and the value of justice. Political agency, the value of political agency, of respecting political agency, has a special status because it's in some sense that I'm not clear about in my own mind, the source of the value of justice, where justice is understood as an ordering of a political community. If justice is seen as the property of a community being well ordered, there is some form of derivative relationship between the two. And it's because of that that justice has a kind of, that political agency has a kind of priority over justice, that allowing for a community to form itself into a political community has this priority. Now, the other reasons I give in the paper, and I find convincing, although I don't know how deep the justification goes, the other reasons I have for saying we need a kind of hierarchy of value, or we need a principle to define these issues, is precisely because otherwise we're left in messy balancing to say, oh, well, here we think it balances one way, there we think it balances another. And I suppose that is itself a kind of pragmatic point, but my concern is that if we simply say it's a matter of balancing value A against value B, and therefore of predicting which form of intervention will maximize the basket of those values, we're fooling ourselves if we think that that's a rational process. We're fooling ourselves if we think that's anything other than hand waving, and it leads to hubris, to being conned into by, as I say, various players on the scene. So those are pragmatic reasons for wanting a kind of hierarchy of value, for thinking that, or consequentialist reasons, I suppose, in some sense, for thinking that we want a kind of deontic structure for governing interventions. So that's part of my thinking about why I want a priority of value on political agency. It's that if we move into balancing, it leads to what I call roughly mischief. But I think there is a special nature to the value of political agency, just as there's a special nature to the value of autonomous agency. It's not that all other values derive from it, but it has a kind of a special hold on our attention, a special claim on our forbearance. I'm going to just actually get a sip of water if I can.
Of course, I'll go.
Okay.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
But so I feel the way you're putting it. So one advantage you get from saying that collective political agency has a kind of priority is that you get a criterion for when intervention might be justified that you wouldn't have otherwise. So on the view where there's just all these values and we're trying to promote them all or something like that, then you do get this kind of murky weighing of values, and you think, oh, could they be a little bit better along this dimension? Yes, let's go in. And that seems crazy.
That's the Canadian invasion case.
Right. So that seems crazy. So on the view, what I think what's attractive about the view you're putting forward is, so you say collective political agency has priority. So that would suggest that we can only go in, or there's only grounds for intervention, if that's not realized in a way that's credible at all. So you have to first see if that's being realized. Mm-hmm. But I feel like you at the same time, you're trying to say there are cases where it's not realized in a way that's credible, but we should let them work it out. And that seems to be an additional claim. Right? So one view would just be we need to structure our intuitions. And the question is just, do they have some kind of plausible claim to self-determination? And that doesn't require democracy. But you go much further than that. And I'm not sure what the argument is there.
Yeah, this is what we were talking about at the reception yesterday. So in an ungoverned state, a state of moral ordism, or a state that's not politics, but just a kind of there's capture by some forces. There's not. Do I have some way of thinking about those spaces as non-political and yet and yet having a kind of moral standing that resists intervention? So one thing is to say I doubt there are any good examples of that, of genuinely ungoverned but inhabited territories. They may have less hierarchical forms of politics, and
Somalia, or like.
Well, I was just thinking of Somalia, sort of, and I don't know much about Somalia. What I read was that Somalia was clearly a terrible scene. It was chaos. People were dying as a result of political conflict and so on, or civil conflict. But the claim that it was entirely ungoverned and nothing but a band of thugs running around actually failed to understand the kind of the politics of the place. It was a bad political scene.
There's a structure.
Yeah, but even it wasn't. It makes it sound sort of too. Who was the ID? The guy the Americans were going after was in fact had a Harvard degree. It was maybe it's an MBA, but still.
It's not a real degree.
No, there was there was an attempt at least in the United States, to characterize the space as nothing but bandits running around, and clearly there were areas with no governance, with no security. But one of the lessons I was very struck by a book I read recently. It was a short book by Rory Stewart and Gerald Naus about it's called "Can Intervention Work?" It's an essay about Kosovo and Afghanistan. And one of the points that Naus, who had spent a lot of time in Kosovo, makes is again that there's one of the failures of the interventionist imagination its imagination of perception is to see that there are governance structures even in spaces that seem ungoverned, that there are usually forms at the village level, say, of Afghanistan, of maintaining local security. They may well not be adequate to the needs, but it seems to me a mistake to say that, or put it another way, we should have a presumption in favor of the idea that there is some kind of political community, however imperfect, in most spaces. So that's, in some sense, to resist the hypothetical. If a space if there genuinely is no political agent there to be respected by forbearing, as I put it, then I guess there's nothing in this argument to say that there's a value to be respected. There's no there. There are a set of other, there's all the pragmatic concerns. I don't mean to dismiss. I just think they're ordinarily not decisive. But there's all the pragmatic concerns about wading in and making things worse rather than better. But I suppose in such cases, there's no. I have no objection to the intervention. And if I say something otherwise in the paper, I think I should probably revise it as a consequence of this discussion.
When you say those cases, what is the threshold?
What is the threshold? Is a place in which a space in which there's I recognize I need a better definition of what politics is.
It's a political
but
agent. If we're talking about an agent, that's a capacious term. Much more than just people
right.
trying to organize themselves in a way that avoids them getting killed. And
Politics, right? So politics includes a system of, of control over property, control over, management of basic security issues, security of persons, and some form of a mechanism for resolving disputes, some sort of justice mechanism. I think those I see as the kind of the three components of political life: property, basically security and dispute resolution. And that by those standards, the parts of Sicily that are ungoverned by Rome but are governed by the mafia count as governed, and I think criminal, it's a line that often depends on the perspective of the viewer, what counts as criminal banditry and what counts as merely poor governance.
Just before we continue, I'm happy to open the discussion to
Maybe
the floor
so
we have time to just, if people want to butt in, just feel free to, but make sure you have the microphone.
It's the most important thing.
Oh, those microphones, okay.
They all work? Okay. I had a question. Maybe you can explain to me in a way that I can understand it better, how to understand political agency different from individual agency. And there are many ways in which it would be similar. And so if we value individual agency, we think individual agency is also something that you couldn't really do from the outside. And so I can't live your life better for you. I can't do things to make you a better agent. If I value you as an agent, I want to let you live your life on your own terms. But we certainly think that people have obligations with respect to providing people with the necessary conditions for agency. And then I wonder, with political agency, if it's similar. So it's not something that we can do for them from the outside, whoever them is. I'm not exactly sure how to figure that out either, but possibly it is something that we can do to ensure that they have the right kind of conditions necessary. And that is something that we can do from the outside. Or I wonder, is there a reason to think that we shouldn't do from the outside? Not only that we shouldn't, but that we actually don't have a duty to do so. So that was...
Yeah, so political agency is what I regard as a form of collective agency, distinguished by the objective, the content, in a sense of of what it's about. So political agency is a form of collective agency. Collective agency is individual agency oriented around a collective project. I didn't spell that out here, but that's what earlier work of mine has been about. So in my view, there is sort of purely individual agency, and then there is individual participation in collective acts. And we have, I see us as kind of split beings, being split between purely self-regarding projects and projects that have this collective domain. Politics is a specific and sort of high-value category of collective agency in which politics is about defining these kind of common modes of life, essentially about those three subjects I mentioned, security and dispute resolution, but in fact encompassing a great deal more in almost every actual case of a political community. It's trying to satisfy a great number of standards of common life. And in my view, religious organizations is an aspect of politics as well in that sense. It's defined, the attempt to define a religious code for a people is an attempt to define a common way of life, usually through some non-force-based coercive mechanism. So politics encompasses a great deal, from my view. Do we have a duty to enhance it? I don't think so. What I said in the talk, I think, is right, which is that we can try to ensure that the conditions of agency are there or are better. That may be practically difficult, but there's I don't see any value barrier to doing so, to to forms of aid that make it easier to engage in politics. And I think there's a line to be drawn. In any particular case, these are contextual lines, they're difficult to say, but there's a line to be drawn between forms of aid which are, facilitative and forms of aid which are coercive. These are in effect a lot of the debates about, say, IMF policy and conditionalities. When does it become a sort of a helping hand, and when does it become a grip on the arm? But I think those are the questions to be resolved, in a sense, moral questions to be resolved about the character of foreign aid and foreign assistance and conditionality. When does it move from my helping you govern yourself to my governing you using the cudgel of aid or assistance? And I don't have any, I think the examples are too varied to have any clear line on that, but my general view is that, right, we can, it's why one of the formulations I give in the paper is too crude, between respecting and promoting, because I think providing these conditions is a form of respecting and promoting. But once that promotion can become what I call managerial or coercive very easily. One of the other things I was musing about, it was partly after a conversation with your environmental colleague, Stephen?
Stephen Wood, yes.
Stephen Wood, who was asking about individuals crossing lines. And I do think there's a difference between individual efforts and state efforts in these cases. One of the pieces of the project of this project I was talking about at lunch, going forward, about sort of uniting kind of work and justice, normative justice, with social science, involves one of the pieces of the project is one about overcoming what we call bad norms, pathological norms. And one of the people who's part of that project has been very involved in attempts to eliminate female excision in, I guess he's been working mostly in Senegal. And these are individual, they're UNESCO sponsored, but often individual level efforts to change a cultural practice that has pernicious consequences. And maybe I haven't reflected deeply enough, but it seems like, as sort of a topic-specific sub-state level or NGO level intervention doesn't seem to me to meet to raise the alarms that we're in effect replacing political agency, that we're displacing political agency. So I do think there are forms of aid, forms of development assistance, including ones that are directed at re-education, at changing cultural practices in various ways, that are not inconsistent with respecting in some sense the standing of the state itself. And I guess it's a harder question if the state says no, you're not sending in any of these women's rights missionaries, in effect. Is there a kind of permission to sneak in and do this kind of work? But it seems to me that the thing that the concern I'm targeting is deeply coupled to force, to occupying armies, to the displacement of whatever governing authority there is in the state, and so that's a fairly high threshold. It allows a range of interactions below that level as well.
If I could just say one more thing, I wouldn't mind if you touched on one of the things Louis-Philippe raised about the minority group within the state. And so if you think about the state as a whole, or the majority, and you might think that a certain action would be seen as coercive, and then you might have the minority, like the girls or the women, saying, this is exactly what we want, please help us, provide us this aid, do whatever. And so which group, how do you decide which group is? Well,
I had meant to come back to that. So I guess there are two different issues. One, I took your example to be, what do we do about a governed territory in which not everybody is engaged in political agency. There's one group, the Shia or the women, who are simply excluded from the process of forming the polity. And it goes back to another point I wanted to talk about, which is whether the connection between political agency and democracy as well. Versus the case in which there's internalized oppression, or at least what we'd regard as internalized oppression. So in the case that you're talking about, Louis-Philippe was talking about, I think the issue is whether the issue is what standing does the majority that's excluding the minority have to repel protection. And I think the sort of straightforward implication of my argument is, as long as they're not killing that minority, as long as we're not in RTP territory, they have the standing to continue this lower grade form of oppression without direct international interference.
So where does apartheid fit in this? Like segregation and subjugation of a part of the population? That's a crime against humanity, isn't it?
Is apartheid defined as a crime against humanity?
That's a good question.
I don't know. I don't know as a legal matter.
Right.
What it would I think
it's in the Rome Statute, but yes.
I think an armed invasion of South Africa would have been wrong. I mean, I am torn in that. Actually, I remember actually arguing the opposite in college. That that it was pure politics. But I think it would have been wrong, and I think whereas I think the trade sanctions were right, and those were partly, I mean, not least because they were in fact requested by the ANC, but but I do think outside nations have a right to sort of decide on sanctions based on their own desire to keep their hands clean, or not. But I think South Africa, is so far actually a pretty good example of why it's better not to intervene in those ways. I mean, we have a very complicated and messy political process that's working its way towards, at various moments, a really inspiring story of overcoming injustice and self-determination. And there's still lots of messy adolescence, but that seems like actually a pretty good example in that sense.
Just to be clear, because I'm not sure I share this sense at all. So suppose that we had good reason to think at the time that only the threat of force would actually have gotten South Africa to get its act together. Mm-hmm. So there would have been no deaths. Because in some sense, those are other considerations, right? Mm-hmm. You would have thought we lacked the legitimacy to threaten the use of force based on the fact that they were oppressing 90-something% of the. I mean, that seems.
There's the particular paradox. Is it
on your own position? I don't see why you would say that.
Is it legitimate to threaten something it would be illegitimate to do?
I didn't mean to go in that direction. I just meant to sharpen our judgments about the matter, because obviously taking on South Africa would have been very messy in a lot of ways. But that can't be. On your view, the question is: was there any ground to go in on the? Because
did
it wasn't.
The Afrikaners have enough? Do they have moral standing?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yes.
They did.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not pretty. It's not pretty. There's a direct
but it seems fully consistent with your view to say this was a travesty of any kind of self-determination. The ideal was being perverted, and so this is a case where you can act seemingly against the ideal in order to have a realization of it that's not a travesty.
Yeah. No, the alternative to that view is to say that self-determination only counts when it's good self-determination, when it meets a high standard of justice.
So I'm interested in the process of becoming a we that's so central to your account, and my suspicion is that if you actually looked at history, and perhaps even South Africa is a good example, you will never find it an actual case that properly satisfied, because there's always something. It's always in some respect forced from some kind of outside. So in South Africa, it was, in addition to the to sanctions and all that, it was ultimately a determination of a certain group of individuals that forced it upon the Afrikaners. It wasn't just kind of them coming to realize that, yes, we've been doing wrong and then going there. And even if you look at Canada, the US, and so on, so we are to some extent, to the extent that you can talk about we in countries with a lot of immigration, but let's leave that aside, are kind of piggybacking on some people who are in some respect did this for us, which is earlier generations, right? We're kind of coming to a ready-made product that we didn't need to go and kind of work at it ourselves, and so that we are enjoying something that so to put it differently, you should have demanded that every nation do it for itself every generation, because and if it's not done, then it's not properly democratic. And then now if you're saying no, we don't need that, then perhaps that suggests that actually your threshold for a functioning democracy, or what motivates us, what we find good about democracies is actually something else, and not so much the we getting together, but in fact perhaps almost the opposite. The fact that democracy, more than any other regime, lets us go our different ways, kind of be diverse, be this ideal that Mill in chapter 3, I think, on liberty of not becoming a collective, and so I'm tempted to this kind of form of consequentialist form of democracy exactly to a great extent because of that, because
it allows us to keep a private space. And
yes, and not necessarily be part of feel ourselves as part of a we.
I mean, I think there are lots of different ways of being a member of a political collective, and and various you don't have to go to the town meetings, you don't have to register to vote, you don't have to be a party activist or in a governing position to be part of that political collective. It's sufficient to go by the rules, to accept an authority, to orient yourself normatively around that authority in some way. That can be behaviorally indistinguishable from somebody who's alienated from that collective, but sort of feels no identification with it, simply trying to do his own thing and stay out of trouble. But I think there is a difference in how whether or not one identifies with a polity. There's a subjective difference that I think matters. There's a separate question. I think it's the state is it can legitimately govern anyone on the territory, and I think responsibility for actions of the state flow to anybody who's in effect collaborating, whether or not they're sort of actively identified. But but in any given actual territory, there will be some people on that territory who are exercising their agency politically, and some minority who are not, even if they're living in our midst, they're maximizing their own utilities and not focusing on the collective project. But it's the political agency of those who are engaged in that project that has the standing, that has the value that I'm insisting on, whether or not others not. And I agree, it's a virtue of democracy and a virtue of liberalism more generally, that to the extent it stays out of people's subjective preferences, it allows people to shield themselves from politics if they don't want that advantage without adverse consequence. But I'm just insisting that for those that there is a special value that arises from the activity of those who are engaged politically. I do think the connection between, what I try to say is, democracy is not identical to political agency. Democracy is a particular expression of political agency organized around these principles of universalism. What I try to say carefully in the paper, maybe not carefully enough, is that not all, but a significant part of what we value in democracy is this exercise of political agency. We value it more the more democratic it is. And it's not that there's a natural, I said that there's a telos between democratic authority and expansion of rights. I don't think there's a natural trajectory from political agency towards democracy itself. I mean, a political community may stay organized in an authoritarian way. I mean, there are other pressures towards democracy, but it's not that politics itself moves democratically, but in the value of politics I'm starting to babble. The connection between politics and democracy is that, as I said, democracy is an especially valuable way of exercising this political agency, one that recognizes the equal moral value of individuals. And I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought. I'll stop there. Try to recover that train.
Well, but so I'm still not sure I see how where the priority comes from then. So clearly there's a value to doing it ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But if with outside
somebody else
help,
could do it better,
not just somebody else would do it better, but with outside help, we'll get there much, much faster. And so there'll be an entire generation who'll be spared apartheid South Africa because of relatively benign outside intervention.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that what the ideal demands? I mean, it can't be that. Unless part of your view is that what makes the value of, say, American democracy right now is partly the fact that it was brought about in an endogenous way back when.
Yeah,
but that can't quite be right. You know, if we found out that as American conservatives tend to think that they were all subject to divine inspiration, that doesn't make it the current value of U.S. democracy any different.
I think is the case
but
to originalist interpretation
right, yeah.
of the Constitution.
right.
Yeah.
I mean, the occupations are. François, you were the one who raised the examples of the occupied Germany and Japan.
Right.
Yeah. Those are an interesting case. Certainly over time, kind of the history matters less, and it's the active continuity that matters more. And it would be crazy now to see Japanese democracy as tainted from its post-war inception by having been imposed. I think occupation it raises different issues than intervention. I mean,
so occupation is not a form of intervention in a sense. It could
I think of occupation as a moral requirement following a war. I mean, it's a moral requirement upon the victors. The contours of that requirement, I think, are developed. Actually, I have another paper on this, but I think there is a kind of a duty to exit once security has been established as quickly as possible. And there's a whole separate set of questions of whether it depends a lot on the justice of the war initially, but it adds to the wrong. If the war was wrong, it adds further to the wrongness of war to leave anarchy in the midst. And if the war was right, then there's still a duty to ensure that institutions of protecting basic human security are present. So that's a case in which there's already. I think it is better in the context of occupation if it's possible to make use of existing governance structures. I think that's better than trying to replace them on moral grounds. But then there are these very complicated issues of, it depends on what the context is, complicated issues of the complicity of the remaining government functionaries. But I think occupation is a really hard issue, but I'd like to keep it separate and think of it a little differently. But yes, a people that's brought about through outside intervention can come to have its own autonomous political agency. That's not paradoxical in my view. It's, we create these are dynamic processes. And once a people has formed, a political agent has formed, then it has the kind of standing I'm talking about. But the question I'm focusing on is whether it's permissible to go in and replace one agent with another, or to attempt to replace one form of political agency with another. So say, I think I'll accept that if there is no such agent at all, there's no objection on my view to going in and helping to form one. But South Africa was a different case. It was, it was a case of, in effect, two political agents in civil conflict. Political agent organized through the ANC and an Afrikaner political agent, and the appropriate response, I think, was to provide soft aid, but not direct armed intervention.
I wonder if it
Microphone.
Oh.
It strikes me that there's sort of two issues here. They both seem to trade on sort of treating the example of the state on a parallel to how we might think about individuals.
Yeah.
And I think both of these have been raised, but they seem to be kind of the same sort of problem. So one is the one that Louis-Philippe raised earlier about the smoking example. So one of the things with the South Africa problem is knowing how many agents are there to begin with. So how many collective agents are there, and when we're trying to figure out which collective agency we're respecting. And then there's another aspect of it over generationally. So this is you might say, well, the part of the thing is when we're talking about an individual, so someone who's growing up, well, there's no question about how many of them there are when they're growing up. There's just one. And then part of what's valuable about maturity is that they go through being a teenager, right? And that's how you get to be it. But that doesn't seem to be quite the same valence when you're talking about an ongoing project across generations, right? So that seems to raise this problem that was raised earlier about, well, things like Japan and Germany and these ongoing democratic ventures, right? So that they both seem to, both of these problems about how we constitute the we to begin with, and then once it's gotten past whatever, once it's stable, the value of its past history seem to be derived from a certain way of thinking about states as on a model with individuals, and we're just not. That seems to be an underlying issue here, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
I do think selves are fairly complicated. I think you said non-smoker you, or smoker you doesn't have a claim against non-smoker you. I don't know. I wonder about that. Does Saturday morning you have a complaint against Friday night you?
Jerry Seinfeld question.
Yeah, it was that. Yeah, I think our own unity over time is something we take responsibility for. We constitute, but it's not crazy to think that we have divided interests at different times or in different aspects of our life. And I think a similar thing is true of political communities, that there are slices and wings and wedges that have legitimate complaints to make against one another. Again, this is just to go back to my sort of relativism about rights is more a sense of their contextual dependence. That it doesn't make sense to say that smoker you has a rights claim against non-smoker you, but a justified complaint of some form, yes. But is the issue? So I agree that it's defining what the boundaries are of the political community is complicated. We can define the boundaries of the state geographically. We can find in terms of a territory, although that's a contingent feature of many of the political communities we're talking about. It's not, I think, a necessary feature that political communities be attached to a territory. I have a friend who's writing a book right now on the soon-to-be territoryless nation states of the South Pacific, one can think of governments in exile in World War II, but one can imagine a people with a form of government without territorial control and without any territory. Nonetheless, it'll be just an odd sort of government, since these people will be living under other governances, but they might still have a distinctive politics, an entity that represents them before the UN, and in search of a new territory and so on. So once we acknowledge that a nation isn't necessarily identified with its territory, it's identified with its people, and we've acknowledged that people can be on a agency-like view of the sort I have, people's membership in that community depends on their own identification, their own participation in that, then boundaries will be fluid. It will be certainly epistemically difficult to determine who's inside and who's outside. People's own motivations and sense of identification will vary. It's not a very good, it's not a very decisive criterion, but I think it's the best we can do for thinking about what matters in making people part of a political community. In any actual politics, there will be some people who will be, coerced into the jurisdiction of that community, but nonetheless, in my subjectivist terms, will stay outside. But I don't see that as a flaw of this picture. I think it reflects what seems to me a messy category, which is politics, a sort of voluntarist model of politics in which who's in and who's out is contextual and varies over time. How did you see it as a problem for this?
My microphone is possible, I'm sorry.
Oh, posterity demands.
So you say things like violence is justified, essential to the formation of a collective democratic agent. People define in politics in their own name. So if you have a situation like apartheid in South Africa, and you say, well, they have to work it out for themselves. Well, the they you're assuming includes the South Africa, which includes the Afrikaners.
Black and white South
yes,
Africans,
right.
yeah.
So why not just say, well, there's actually two collective, and
Yeah.
we just want to go. We're going to interfere because there's one collective agent who is not being allowed to have the formation of a collective democratic agent, right? So that seems
Yeah.
to be the issue. Whereas if you
I
have
see,
an
yeah.
individual, you can a little bit easier to say.
Yeah, well, right, or an individual split personality. Right, I mean, the one thread I've left hanging very clearly is what do you do when, in these cases of civil conflict, I mean, it's this, or the Libya case where it's not unwanted interference by both people, both groups who can claim to be in governance, but only by one, which is, I guess, is probably the standard case in which there's one party who's inviting intervention, gambling on it in effect, and another who's not. In one sense, in that case, the respect for the standing goes to those who hold authority over the territory. I mean, the hope is that there are, in that sense, it's an interesting problem. I do want to say that there are two sort of rival political groups. We have, in any successionist or revolutionary moment, there is fundamental disunity. And yet, the claim against intervention is, I think, grounded in, I guess there's a certain, on my view, there's a priority to those who want to exclude the intervention, a priority of those who want to attempt to secure governance themselves through repressing the revolutionary group or negotiating with it, and so on. And so when I say we owe it to them to let them work it out themselves, I guess in that sense the them is the state authority, the one being resisted, and that's I see it's an awkward implication of this view, but the justification, to say the practical justification of the view I take is that any alternative is too dangerous. That saying intervention is a more contextual view. It says intervention is appropriate whenever it will seem to lead to the conditions of success, the better party winning, is not just one that's likely to lead to trouble, but is one that fails to be respectful of the autonomy of even the political agent who's demanding intervention, political agent who hopes to achieve territorial control. It's just restating the conclusion, I guess. But
you came this close to saying we should make ourselves believe a false theory because it'll have good consequences.
No, I think it's a true theory.
Very, very close to saying that. So if we start thinking that it's all up for grabs, then we're going to start intervening too much.
Yeah.
So we should think that the bar on intervention is extremely high.
Yeah.
But then you also want to say it's true, but we still don't quite know why the white South African can tell the rest of the world, you can't stop me from oppressing these people. I'm in the middle of something here.
Right. What I want to say is not that it's a false theory that we should believe because it leads to better consequences, but that it's a theory whose borders are fuzzier than the principled line I want to draw. I think there's a reason
we need sharp.
we need a sharp
lines.
we need a sharp line here. You know, we need to eliminate the possibility of trade-offs at the margin, not because there isn't an actual conflict of values, but because only a sharp line policy, you know, well, sharp line policy leads to better consequences. But the grounds for that policy it's not just kind of welfare maximization. It is respect for a distinctive value of not that we're trying to maximize, but that we're trying to honor.
Couldn't there be an issue with the scope of R2P? Where we're just looking now at
Yeah.
Wikipedia, what it has to say about crimes of apartheid, so we don't know about the truth of this. I should never be doing this, my students shouldn't be watching. But it says that apartheid is
Wikipedia is for the privacy of your office.
No, we should actually look at the statute.
So the crime of apartheid is defined by the 2002 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court as the inhumane acts of a character similar to other crimes against humanity.
So it's also like we're in a murky territory here, right? So if you
But the ICC statute defines apartheid as a crime.
yeah.
Yeah.
So the question is
Crime of apartheid.
similar to crimes against humanity. So that might also muddy the water because you're willing to concede that R2P is
But although
legitimate,
crimes against
right?
humanity is it's a pretty amorphous category. I mean, that's, you know, how many civilian protesters do you kill before it's not maintaining government authority, but becomes a crime of humanity. The numbers are not very high, depending on who the targeted state is.
Right, but in a situation like South Africa or like Afghanistan, where there's a significant portion of the population, in the case of Afghanistan, half, you could say, well, it's very close to it.
Yeah.
So and it seems that it's not just a case of democracy there. We're prompted to say we want to go in because this is terrible what's happening.
Right, no, this is a terrible crime, yes.
So in a sense, these are not the clearest case for your test cases for your theory.
No, I mean, I certainly think that apartheid is and was a crime, and a crime against humanity.
Because there's word that's not done, which is you say R2P is legitimate, right? So in the cases of mass atrocities and so forth, so there might be some work to be done in terms of trying to reconcile that border, because that's really what you're trying to do. You're trying to reconcile the decent society with the R2P case and saying, well, there's something in the middle, right? And
right, that's the middle case. But the R2P boundary is itself pretty fluid, and that's I recognize that going in that and those are the difficult cases. Is it the Libya and the Syria cases, in effect, where you have a good argument for R2P's violation, but that.
Right. So one last question. Then. Yes.
So one of my questions was kind of a line drawing, and of course, there's vagueness that's there, and I'm not asking for kind of a clear line, but I thought it's not difficult to come up with all kinds of kind of hypotheticals that perhaps will trouble you. So you said Canadian government now trying to influence public opinion in the U.S. with regard to healthcare. That's inappropriate. But let's take the example of a government, let's say the U.S. government or whatever, establishing a program about the value of democracy, and it sends and it pays for it, and it takes place in the U.S. and young bright people from non-democratic countries go there and learn this, and then come back to their own countries and promote the idea of democracy, and I would think that that's fine, but then if that's fine, then the boundary line between this and Americans actually going to those countries and spreading the word is very difficult to draw. And so again, so what I'm asking is not exactly for where the line is drawn, but more kind of help with thinking in the nonviolent cases, which ones would, or how we could say distinguish between the yes and the no's. I don't have a clear view on these. I think I was saying yesterday there does seem to me, so covert aid I think is wrong. Covert sort of political intervention, nonviolent political intervention. Overt campaigns, on the one hand, there's something distasteful about it. I find something distasteful even about overt sort of
outside political interference. On the other hand, as I say, lobbying seems to me legitimate, and as a general matter, things that sort of contribute to a more complex cognitive environment for citizens, whether they come from outside or inside, seem to me in general good for democracy. So to have outside views brought in. So if Canada, is there a Radio Free Canada that's broadcast across the southern border, or the
nowadays with the internet, everything you can.
But in effect, so I guess I think the view. I think what I want to say is that any form of overt nonviolent aid is permissible. There's an awkwardness about it, but it doesn't undermine political agency in the ways that armed intervention does. That's probably inconsistent with something I said yesterday, but so be it.
On this inconclusive note, I'm going to conclude. I'd like you to join me in thanking Professor Kutz for a lecture, a nice lecture and a thought-provoking seminar. And thank you very much for coming to Osgoode to see us and to presenting us these very thought-provoking thoughts. Thank you.